I went from a complete amateur to a total expert corset maker in the space of 3 weeks. That is a slight exaggeration. Okay, a large exaggeration. But I did speedrun learning to make a corset properly and ended up with the most beautiful, perfect, and detailed corset for my dream costume. My magnum opus, this Fern Calloway cosplay. Hello, I'm Miss Twisted. You guys can call me Charlotte. I do crafting, cosplay, and other weird and whimsical stuff, and I started this project over a year ago. Since then, I've made the legs and the skirt, and I've been procrastinating the corset. Why? Because this part intimidates me. I'm allergic to using patterns and instruction intolerant, and I'm really good at just f***ing around and finding out when it comes to my cosplays, but I don't think I can run off pure vibes for this one. It's got a proper fitted curvy shape, these hip panels, these tiny flower details, and this bad boy is going to be load bearing because you've got all of the skirt layers, foliage, and the top of some fairy goat legs that are all gonna get held up in here. So stick around to watch me constantly fight the urge to throw away all of my patterns and measurements and just go full feral crafting again. And before I get stuck into crafting, I've made myself a bit of a game plan to get myself organized with the help of today's sponsor, Milanote. Milanote is an organization tool for creative projects, and they've become a regular sight in my videos because I genuinely find it such a useful, versatile, and intuitive tool to use. Fern is the biggest project I've ever done, so naturally my Milanote board is huge this time. I've got my main overview, my mood board, and of course a section just for the corset. There's loads of built-in templates, so I like to start with the project plan and then jump straight into the mood board. Side note, being able to nest boards within boards is one of my favorite features, especially for a really huge project like this. In here, I can start sorting all of the images and references that I've been collecting from all over the web using Milanote's web clipper tool. No awkward screenshots or losing your sources. I can pull my color scheme directly from the concept art I've cropped in here. This was really useful later on for buying embroidery thread. And I can add text and drawing right on top. Back out to the main board, and I'm keeping this as a broader overview of the project with a checklist of each section and videos for future reference. Finally, I'm getting into the nitty-gritty with a nested board for the corset part with some tutorial references, a list of steps, shopping list, and even a rough calendar schedule. You can even put in Google Maps links, which I use for my favorite supply stores. For group projects, you can share your Milanote board so your whole team can collaborate and edit together. And you can access and edit your board on the app so you can reference it on the go. But all of this is just how I use Milanote. There is stuff here for writers, for home renovators, for podcasters, or marketing. Just to name a few of what Milanote has to offer. I keep coming back to Milanote for every project. It's free with no time limit, so try it for yourself. Sign up for free using the link in my description below. But now that that's all organized, let's begin at the beginning with a mock-up using a pattern. Just kidding, I still managed to squeeze in a little bit more procrastination by pre-cutting a lot of my flat steel boning, which was easier said than done, even with these aviation snips. I have the upper body strength of a limp noodle, so yeah, this was kinda hard. I did enjoy taking a Dremel to these to smooth over those edges for obvious reasons. Sparks are pretty, my lizard brain's happy. I don't want to do this. Somebody in the comments psychoanalyze me and tell me why it is I have such an aversion to the idea of following instructions. All right, measurements. Under bust is something like this. Might be a little bit big because I'm wearing like 3 different thermal layers under here. I don't feel like taking them off for the measurements, so we're just gonna guesstimate. I've got some really thick, cheap canvas that I'm going to use to make my mock-up out of these pieces. I'll put a link to this corset pattern in the description below because I was really impressed with it. Not that I have much to compare to as someone who doesn't use patterns. Now, I've already established that I have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to corsets. So I guess please don't use this video as a tutorial. That's just going to be the blind leading the blind here. But doing my due diligence, Doing my due diligence, is that right? Anyway, I'll put in the description a couple of resources that I really liked when it comes to corset general knowledge. Now I've got my excuse for when I forget to explain steps. I'm gonna start off with the busk. That's these two flat metal bits here that are gonna hook together the corset at the front. Lots of corsets don't have this, you just kind of pull over the head instead. In fact, Fern's corset doesn't appear to have one in the concept art, but it does also have a ton of skirts and a lot of detail going on around the top. So I think it's gonna make my life so much easier if I can just pull it on around my waist once everything else is on, rather than trying to pull it on over my head. Side note, I printed this so I could have a physical copy that stares at me in my workspace, basically to guilt trip me into working on this instead of procrastinating. Anywho, I've got a folded piece of the mock-up here that I'm gonna poke some holes into to allow these little dot things to poke through. On the other side, the bar with these tabs is going to poke through the side of that fabric and hook over those dots. The final corset is going to be two pieces of fabric sewn together rather than folded in half like this one. So usually you'd sew it together between those tabs, leaving a gap for them to poke out. But since my mock-up's just a folded piece of fabric, I can just cut some slits in it. I sewed my mock-up pieces together and I'm gonna press out each of these seams. If I'm skipping over stuff here, don't worry about it. This is the mock-up. We're gonna go through this like another 3 more times. And next time I'll position my camera better so I don't fog up the lens. This can't be good for the equipment. For boning channels, I've got some old bias binding. I've got a strip basically sitting on each of the seams of this mock-up, and I'm gonna sew down the side of each one, essentially creating like a long tube in which I can put the boning. This stuff is just cheap, basic plastic boning here. I don't want to use anything too fancy on the mock-ups. Okay, first ever mock-up using an actual pattern from start to finish. Let's give it a go. So first mock-up. It's a perfect fit, no notes. Everything's centered nicely, nothing's pinching in, nothing's giving me too much room anywhere where I don't want it. There's still like a little bit of space here at the back in case I want to like cinch in a little bit further. There's no real restrictions in terms of movement, like, yeah. So I consider myself pretty good at just figuring out things for myself, but I've avoided using patterns not because I think they're objectively bad, but because they just seem like more work and more maths than just like figuring it out for yourself. And I've developed this twisted sense of pride from not using them. I really chose the messiest pie for this metaphor, didn't I? I've made plenty of corsets before, but none of them really ever fitted me all that well. You just can't tell from the outside because they look really pretty and they were kind of close enough. But the fact that the first ever time I follow a pattern properly from start to finish and it fits like a damn glove, well, I should have swallowed my pride, pun definitely intended, a lot sooner. Not to say I'm gonna quit experimenting with my cosplays, but more to say, yeah, maybe it's a good idea to rely on some tried and true resources as a starting point, hey. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, Miss Twisted, shocked and confused to find patterns good, actually. Alright, I'm gonna finish this off, which was definitely not an excuse to have a lemon meringue pie as a tax write-off, and then we can move on. So for my practice corset, I've got 2 layers. One of them is this, which is couture. Couture is basically like a very strong, stiff, non-stretch fabric, usually cotton, and it just makes for a great base for corsets because it holds its shape really well and it takes a lot of strain. For the fashion layer, that's the part you're gonna see, I have the most beautiful, fiery copper colored like silk dupion. I bought this 5 years ago. It's one of those things I bought with no purpose. I just had to have it in my fabric stash, and I've been holding on to it because it felt too precious to use. But I don't want to fall into the trap of a thing just hanging around and gathering dust because I'm constantly too scared to use it. I'm just going to use it in this one. So I basically want to make a full practice corset using this pattern just so I can feel really confident in all the processes before I move on to my fern corset. And dupion is usually pretty strong and non-stretch, so it makes for a pretty damn good corset. Each piece of my pattern has 4 versions of it cut out, 2 of the fashion layer and 2 of that black couture seal layer. Since both sides of the corset are mirrored, I've sewn all 4 pieces of this corset together, and I've marked out the exact line that sits in the center of the waist so that I can use some fabric glue to basically attach down the waist tape here. Fabric glue is not going to hold this thing, but it's just to hold it in place until I can get the stitches down on the boning channel, which is also going to hold that waist tape in place. So now I have my 2 fashion layer pieces all sewn together, and my strength pieces looking like a rack of ribs or something with all that boning in there. And this morning I was going to put in the busk, but I've realized that this busk is actually like way too long for the corset I've got. Like, it sticks out either end, and that is hilarious to me because I knew that. I knew that because the same thing happened on my like mock-up here where it sticks out. So I had like mentally noted to myself, make sure that I elongate the pattern a little tiny bit to accommodate for that. And then I just forgot. So these ones are not going to work for this one, but I have a solution. The solution is I already own a corset with shorter busks. So this little flappy bit here, that is usually like to hide that tiny little sliver of skin that would show between these 2 pieces. I'm not going to do that on my corsets, but I'm going to put a pin in that concept generally. I have an idea I'll come back to later. So we've sewn together the fashion layer and strength layer of this corset right here at the front so that I can insert the busk that's newly harvested out of that old corset. And sewn a line right down the side of this one to keep that busk in place. Let's skip ahead a little because we got 2 more rounds of corsets after this, and no one needs to see me struggle with this one 3 times. Okay, corset number 1. Finished aside from the bias binding at the top and bottom to seal these edges. There's like a little bit of warping in this like top floating layer. I think it ended up being maybe a tiny bit smaller than the strength layer underneath. I think I just need to cut out my pattern pieces a little more precisely and I should be good to go. We are moving on to corset number 2, which is my practice final fern corset. So I'm literally going to use a very similar dupion to what I plan to use for the final one that is already gradient dyed, because I did a bunch of testers back when I made the skirt and I've stuffed most of this up. For starters, a little bit too much of that intense orange. Secondly, a lot of this, it's really hard to tell in camera, but like the fabric is kind of permanently wrinkled and crinkled. Apparently with dupion, it holds wrinkles so easily that if you like scrunch it and leave it scrunched for too long, it can just kind of like permanently crease the fabric. I didn't know this, have discovered it the hard way. What I can do is use all of this stuff to practice like lining up my gradient pieces and kind of what the final might look like. Is it a little bit overkill doing an entire practice corset before I do the final one? Maybe, but fern is supposed to be like my magnum opus, so I'm giving myself permission to overdo it on this one. This round, I'm making some heavy modifications to that pattern, both in length and in shape. And remember how the pre-made corset had that flappy bit at the back of the busk? I want to try something like that, but at the front of the busk, essentially to conceal it so it looks more like the concept art with no visible busk. Couldn't find any good guides on this topic, but I've just kind of mucked around with some folds and it seems to be working. So on this one, I need to calculate the flap area first, and then it doubles back down into doing this. Oh man, that does not make sense even to me. So really the only part I need to cover is like here. Flap of around that length. So that's extension number 1. Extension number 2 will be the fold back in on itself. And then we fold here, this piece comes under. So this will form the very front piece, which is unmarked. Yeah, so I think it's essentially, oh my god, it's just folding freaking pleats, isn't it? That's all there is to this, and I've made it so complicated. I think that would work. Okay, concealed busk works. I feel like a genius, even though what I've worked out is probably very commonplace for a lot of seamstresses, and like it's actually really obvious now that I think about it. I just kind of had to get my head around it, you know? Okay, iron-on stabilizer on all of my dupion pieces to keep them nice and crisp, and I'm just re-ironing everything as I'm putting in this concealed busk because I really do want this part to work. You can see I put that extra flap on the dot side rather than the tab side. I think this might have been the wrong decision. My new and improved pattern I've transferred to this sort of semi-see-through sheet, and I've taken extra care to make sure that my seam allowances and waist tape placements are all consistent too. The boning channels are now in the middle of each panel rather than the seams. Put a pin in that, we'll come back to it. Also, let's please ignore the fact that I forgot to keep my sides of the gradient consistent with this one. I'm tracing out Fern's hip panel section. My plan is to cut this fabric on the bias so that it has a little bit of give and wiggle room to curve nicely over that hip. With that sewn on and looking good, I've got an embroidery hoop in here because I want to do a couple of practiced little tiny embroidery flowers. We'll talk a little more about the decoration in the final round. I just figured why not practice the decoration on the practice corset. I'm not going to cover the whole practice corset with it because I don't want to waste the thread. I just really wanted to make sure that I was happy with how this looks. So I think we can put the other end together and get this into a actual functioning corset. Okay, not a bad practice round. Now, I mean, this one was the first time with me using the new pattern where I've kind of added a bunch of stuff and elongated a bunch of stuff. So there was always going to be some teething problems. For starters, I don't think this hidden busk idea is really working for me. You can see it's really flappy and is still sitting up. I have sewn these two panel pieces here so that the force here isn't pulling this that way, but then also this is still kind of wrinkling up and puckering outwards, and I don't know if it's really worth trying to fix that or just finding a different solution. Okay, so I've been going back over my mood board for inspiration and brainstorming a little, and I have an idea on how I'm still going to disguise this busk. If I play my cards right, it's relatively risk-free in terms of using up materials, so I'm gonna just try it straight on the final corset. And while my original plan was to do my practice corset to completion, I don't think I'm gonna do that. Let's be honest, there was always gonna be a limit to exactly how much practice and doing things the right way and following instructions you can really do before I just need to let my f*** around and find out instincts kick in and smash out the final product. Okay, welcome to my kitchen. We're gonna gradient dye our final pieces. We've got this lovely buttery yellow silk dupion, and I have a pot with some water and a little bit of these two. All right, Tessa's getting dunked in some clear water. I'm gonna just start dipping this in and out slowly. Not super slowly because this is gonna take pretty fast. Do a tiny dunk, give this a rinse, hang it up to dry. Okay, test a piece dry, and that is exactly what I'm aiming for. And you can see that it's caught on some of the slubbing. That is what I want because I think it looks so freaking cool. It's a beautiful texture. It kind of makes it look like someone's painted at sunset or something like that. Anyway, let's go dye some pieces. For some reason, I've done an alarming amount of projects in the past that involve gradient dyeing, so I'm pretty practiced at this, and I've learned a lot of lessons the hard way. If you want a more thorough look at dyeing and gradient dyeing, go check out my video on making fern skirts. At least this time I'm inside and don't have any hula hoops involved. In washing, I am keeping that water running towards the dyed section. I don't want any color bleeding into the lovely yellow. And I'm trying to keep this relatively flat even as I'm applying soap so I don't get those scrunch lines like last time. Once those pieces are dry, each of them are getting some iron-on stabilizer. They're gonna need that extra stability, especially for the pieces with the embroidered flowers. Okay, the color and texture and gradient on these pieces. Oh, this makes me so happy. This looks fantastic. I'm real chuffed. So before I cut out all these pieces, I'm gonna do the two busk pieces first, just because they're the most central pieces and then I can build outwards. Don't know if that really benefits me, but that's what I'm gonna do. You guys know the drill by now when it comes to making busks. I'm doing all the same steps here. I'm just being, I guess, extra careful about it just because this is now the final thing. I opted to embroider these front two panels first before I move on, so I'm gonna guesstimate roughly where each flower sits. For my embroidery floss, well, the majority of this stuff I got at op shops just because they always have a massive treasure trove of knitting and yarns and sewing stuff. So I only really had to buy one or two colors and they're cheap as chips anyway. Now I loathe hand sewing with the fiery passion of 1,000 suns, but I can make an exception for hand embroidery. It just feels very intuitive to me, like painting. You just think of your shape and you start sewing it, if that makes sense. My practice flowers I did earlier, I used some different shades of purple, but I opted to keep things simpler for this time just because there are going to be so many different flowers on this thing. I don't want it to get too busy. Usually you would do hand embroidery on like an embroidery hoop to stretch out the fabric, right? And that's kind of why I'm getting like a little bit of warping in the fabric. I've been careful to do relatively loose stitching, and because it's a corset, the whole thing's gonna hold itself taut anyway. But I do think the rest of the pieces that aren't the busk, I am definitely gonna put on a hoop. It's gonna make my life so much easier. I don't fully understand why, but in my brain I was just adamant I wanted to do these with the busk piece already made and ready to rumble. I have found that pressing these with the iron really hot and really heavy, don't take that out of context, does kind of help just flatten everything out as well. So I'm not too worried about that warping. I'm going to go do the same with that one. I think this is going to be a couple of days of just embroidery. I'm very torn about that because on the one hand, it forces me to slow down and pace myself, which is probably good for my mental health. On the other, it forces me to slow down and pace myself. And I'm not good at that. I'm not a patient person. But in this case, my determination is overriding my impatience. So let's do it. Luckily, I did have the hindsight here to line up my gradient dyeing and mark where the flowers are going to be all before I cut out the final pattern. I think if I'd stuffed up the gradient dyeing positioning again, I might have just straight up cried. It wouldn't be the first time I've cried over this cosplay. This time round, all of my pieces are getting an embroidery hoop and some additional stabilizer at the back as I sew these. These flowers are so tiny on the concept art that you can't actually really pick out any details about them, so I'm just doing a range of different shapes from these more like wattle starburst shapes to more defined petals. And well, after a bit, what else is there to do but sort of settle in, get into the swing of things, and just keep chugging along. I don't have enough patience to enjoy this process, but it wasn't as torturous as I thought, especially once I settled into some like 3 and 4 hour video essays. Side note, if you have any video essays to recommend me, chuck them in the comments. I love that stuff. I love Philosophy Tube, Jacob Geller, Hello Future Me, Quinn's Ideas, Juno Moth, Super Eye Patch Wolf, Izzy's. Heck, I'm always open to more. Okay, I've been embroidering flowers for 2 days and I think I'm finally done. I've got 8 panels finished here. My joints and my hands feel awful. Like I feel like I've just got old lady hands, like I'm putting myself into early arthritis. I guess people that hand sew all the time just kind of develop the skills and the joints for it. In any case, I'm really chuffed with these. I think before I get carried away and like try and do the floating flowers and some beadwork in the center of each of these, I need to cut out my pieces and kind of sew together most of my corset first, because I want to be able to like iron those seams without things like beads and floating flowers that stick on top getting in the way. The fact that I'm being really sensible about the order that I do things, that's new territory for me. I'm not usually this organized. With my pieces cut out, I did discover some of those flowers went a little too close to those seams, so I had to unstitch a couple of them before I sewed my seams together. And let me tell you guys, I have never cut out fabric or sewn together seams more carefully and precisely than I have this time round. At some point I felt like I was diffusing a bomb, like I was so stressed about getting this perfect. How good is that gradient? God damn! A really good press seam. It looks so crisp and satisfying that I'm kind of sad all of these are going to get covered up with some sort of yellow strip that goes down there. But speaking of strips, for the actual boning, I've got this stuff here, which is boning casing. It's literally just like a big strip of stuff that's like hollow in the middle so you can thread the boning in there, which I think is going to be a little bit easier for me to use than the bias binding I've been using up until now. And unlike the bias binding, the casing is fully enclosed, which means I can use my cheat method of like tacking this one down before I sew it to hold it in place. Along with a thin strip of waist tape through the middle here, that's just going to help cinch in and reinforce that waist. Now the boning channels are all getting sewn onto that back strength layer so that you won't really see any of those stitching through that front. We've got flat steel boning going in the front and synthetic whalebone that's got a little bit more give to it throughout those middle pieces to account for some curve. And the flat steel's going in the very back edge here too. And I can't believe it took me till this year to start doing this, but I bought a zipper foot just so I can sew nice and close to the boning without breaking a needle. Folks, it is time for one of my absolute favorite cosplay tools. All hail the Grommet press. This beast has unironically become one of my absolute favorite cosplay tools. It presses in grommets, it presses in rivets, you can hole punch pretty much anything with this, and it's also just really fun to use. I didn't think my awl could poke holes through a layer of coutil, dupion, and the stabilizer, so I am using a hole punch for this part. Switching out my hole punch for the grommet press section, and I'm just gonna get these grommets pressed in so fast at the back here, throw some lacing in, and we are ready to give this a test drive. Okay, now the construction elements are all done and I can actually try it on. The fit is phenomenal. Everything's sitting nicely, like the texture of that dupion. Oh, it's so good. The gradient and the flowers. The part I was most worried about was making sure this was a perfect fit. And I think we've gotten there. And I honestly think that is partly because I've made this like 4 times now. So let's get into the rest of it. I've got some twisted cord here that I want to apply onto each of these seams just to mirror the same yellow lines that Fern has on her corset. And this is sewing through both layers. So now you can see why I wanted to put the boning in the center of each panel rather than the seams. Okay, piping is now on the seams. I like how that looks. It has gotten me back focused on how to cover this front busk. And I think I've got something which is kind of a return to my original idea, but with a bit of a twist. So I've made this thing here, which is literally just like an offcut of that gradient dyeing with some of that piping just tacked on there. I'm wondering if I can hand stitch this in place exactly like that. So basically the piping will form exactly on the edge here, and this will form the flap. And because it is like an entire separate piece that floats off the top of this, it shouldn't get like pulled around, which was the problem I had to start with. So I'm gonna try it. It sucks because I think I'm gonna have to hand stitch that because it's right against that metal busk. But I think if it can work, like, that looks so freaking good. Now, I tolerated embroidering those flowers by hand, but I was definitely fighting my own impatience, just trying to make sure that I did this neatly and not rush it. The willpower it took was crazy, but the results are incredible. This is so crisp. For the hip panels, I was back to my fabric glue as an alternative to tacking stitch, illegal sewing technique ways. You can take the ferrule crafting out of the project, but you can't take the gal out of the ferrule. You get the idea, right? I still did sew these on, being very careful to avoid the boning. So, bias binding, that is how we're gonna seal up the top and bottom. So with the spare dupion that I have, I'm gonna cut out a strip right on the diagonal here, and I'm running those strips through a bias tape maker, which is just gonna help fold it into place. It's easier said than done. These things are a little finicky. I did do most of the bias binding off camera because it was late last night at like no left o'clock. But the good news is I think we're in the home stretch. Like there's not much left to do now. And quite frankly, thank God, I need an entirely non-sewing project after this. The bias binding is getting clipped onto that top edge, and I'm sewing it on at the same time that I sew on this piece of cording. In another example of uncharacteristic foresight for this project, I cut all of my boning pieces earlier, just slightly shorter than the corset itself. That means as long as I push the boning down as I go, I can sew along this whole top bit without hitting any of those boning pieces. All right, folks, we are almost there. Home stretch. So you can see how she's got like this little frill on the bottom of her corset here. So for that, I've just made a big long strip of this silk dupion that's been gradient dyed, and I had to do this in like several different pieces and then sew them together because, as you can imagine, trying to gradient dye something this long into a pot would really suck. But the idea is that I'm just gonna ruffle the heck out of this and sew it onto the bottom of the corset. I've sewn a long straight stitch right along the top of this piece with no back stitching. So if you grab one of those threads and carefully pull, you can gradually ruffle this up. Not quite as satisfying as my usual technique, which is just mashing the fabric into the sewing machine, but having this one neat and even is kind of important this time round. Gluing this one down with some more of that piping, and then once again hand stitching this one. I hate this so much. I just thought I'd pause to let you guys know that this is the worst thing ever. Like, I didn't really mind the hand embroidery for the flowers, but like hand stitching on the bias binding and the piping frill piece here, this is the worst. I'm having the least amount of fun that I've ever had cosplaying. There's not really any way around it apart from just to suck it up and do it. So I'm just gonna keep doing it. The back side of the bias binding, not quite as difficult. There's just not as much to get through with that needle. Okay, I haven't filmed the process for this bit because I was planning on doing that on the other half, but I've been doing these little seed bead clusters in the center of each of those flowers. I've been doing that for a couple of hours, and now my hands really hurt from trying to hold that tiny needle and squeeze it through all of this really thick fabric, and my eyes hurt because for half of that I wasn't wearing my glasses. I'm still new to wearing glasses, but I got them for the purpose of helping my eyes with all of these close-up detail work, so it's not going to help my eyes if I'm not wearing them. All this to say, I've been staring at the seed bead clusters for a few hours now, enough to definitively say, I don't like them. We're not doing the seed bead clusters anymore. Something about them, my instinct just says no. Instead, I'm going to try doing a bunch of flat back crystals in the center of each of these. It will be easier, which is a bonus, but my main concern is just that it'll be hopefully like a cleaner and sleeker finish overall. Like, you probably can't pick it up on camera, but these are quite bobbly. And like, I like the organic touch. I might use those for some of the flowers that are fabric flowers. I don't know, I think I'm just trying to justify it, but I'm mostly running off vibes again. We've got good old reliable E6000 in the center of each of these flowers. And I drove over 2 hours to go to my favorite place I knew had these crystals in exactly the right size and colors. So you might have heard me mention floating flowers or fabric flowers. What that's about is Fern's got like not just those tiny flowers on her corset, but loads of tiny and larger flowers like on her skirt, on her hair, all that sort of thing, which I'm probably going to make out of fabric at some point. But what I want to do is add a couple of those fabric flowers onto that corset. They'll sort of blend in amongst a lot of the embroidery flowers. But my thought is that maybe like Fern's wild fae magic or druid magic is making the flowers that are decorative on her corset slowly come to life and start growing off the actual corset too, like the other bits of foliage. This is so unnecessary. Like, the concept art does not demand this. Nobody is asking me to do this. Most people are not even going to notice this on the costume because it's going to be so subtle, but it's one of those tiny little visual storytelling elements that I came up with, and so now I just have to do it, even if it means giving myself a lot of extra work for no particular reason. I mean, at the very least, it's going to be practice for when I do all those tiny flowers on the rest of her. So we've got some scraps here of cheap party satin and lining fabrics, and I've got this stuff, stiffened stuff to be exact. I'm basically just brushing it on. I'm not even bothering spraying because I want to absolutely soak this fabric. I might have gone a little bit overboard. Good morning, folks. I have left these all entirely to dry, so we can peel them off and see if they're going to make us some flowers. Very satisfying. Oh my goodness. Hey, okay, that's really promising. So yeah, it's changed literally fabric satin to have this like waterproof plasticky paper texture. Take a little bit here. If I cut that, what I want to see is, okay, that's what I want to see. I'm not seeing like fraying happening on this edge here, even if I try and like worry at it. Okay, if I cut myself out a petal like this and I want it to like be a little bit curved, because I think traditionally they would do this with heat and like these weird expensive tools, but I think that I might be able to just, yeah. So if I start to pull on that, I can get some cool texture. I don't know if it's going to be necessary for this part because the flowers on the corset are going to be so minuscule, and that's so staticky. Oh my goodness, look at that. And if I try and like, you know, just physically cut one out, to cut one out that small is going to be so hard for me to like get the shape right and to get it even each time. And then I was thinking about this. I just bought this thing, which is literally like a confetti, you know, hole punch sort of thing. And it works pretty well on paper. Like you can see I've tested it out here. I want to test it out on this, but if I don't, I've got an alternative idea. I don't imagine this would work well on regular fabric because it would just kind of get caught in the thing. But because this one's kind of gone all crisp and like a papery texture, that sounded good. Oh, I think that worked really well. Okay, not quite. So it almost worked. No, it's all gotten caught in here. Okay, this hole punch is not designed for fabric, clearly. All right, that's a no on my fancy hole punch, but I don't regret it. It was worth a shot, and I have a feeling I'll have use for these in future for something. I don't know. Third option is my happy medium. So I'm literally just gonna do like snowflake style, right? Where you just fold the edges and you fold it in half and then you fold it in half again. You know what? I'm not gonna get this at this angle. Let's move this around a second. Okay, little square of fabric, folded and folded again. And then I'm gonna take this middle corner here, and from there, I'm gonna go out like this. That's gonna form. Hey, there we go. That's kind of what I was thinking, right? I got my 4 little petals there. Look how tiny this is in my hands, and I have small hands anyway, doing this like surgery because my fingers are too big for this. Like if I do that, and then like that, can you see the vision? The funny thing is I thought I was cutting these so small, but they're still a little bit big, so I'm gonna have to cut these like a little bit smaller again. They're so tiny. This stuff right here is why people get confused about cosplay competitions when like these really intricate cosplays win, because you don't see a lot of these details from afar, so they look so plain next to like really big builds, but like there's all these teensy little details like this. The main issue is these look very flat and textureless and cartoony, so I figured out that if I take one of these makeup sponges and push into the center of it with some tweezers, I'm gonna steam the heck out of that right before I push it in, and it basically scrunches that around the tweezers to create some creases that I just otherwise wouldn't be able to get because they're so tiny. So now I can tie some thread to my corset here with a little bit of E6000 here just for that extra reinforcement, and then sew 2 of these 4 petal pieces together. That actually makes for a very convincing little floating flower here, especially with one of my crystals to help blend it into the surroundings. When I started making more of these, I did a couple of variations as well, so there was just as much variety as with the embroidered flowers. And despite how tiny and tedious these were, I had a great time making them, so I'm glad to finish on a high note. And with the last of those floating flowers attached, we have ourselves a finished corset. I don't think I've ever made anything as neatly and precisely as I've made this corset. I even gradient dyed the back lacing to better match that orange. But seeing me dangle it at the camera or like sitting flat on my desk isn't going to give you a proper idea of what this actually looks like. So let's put this on with all of my skirts and do a proper reveal. Now before anyone comments about actually that's not accurate, this is not Fern's horns, these are not Fern's flowers. This is a random strip of leftover green material across my chest. I've just slapped these ones on to try and make the reveal a little bit more Fern-ish. Fern-esque, like to give you an idea of what it may feel like for the final product, you know? With all of that said, here we go, the final corset on and sitting with the rest of the costume so far. Everything's sitting nicely, it's comfy, like all of those details together sit so well. There's already a couple of tweaks I want to make. For starters, I want to shorten the frill a little bit. I want to actually shorten the whole corset because it just feels a little bit long, but all of those things are future Charlotte's problem. For now, I am really happy with how this is looking. And I don't know if you guys can tell, but I've added some extra layers to the skirt, so it's like organza and tulle petticoats under here, so it's just extra floaty and dreamy now. And let's be honest, a costume like this demands to be frolicked in, so let's take this outside. And a lovely sunny day outside did mean the crunchiest lighting ever, but it stopped me freezing my butt off. And I did manage to find that one patch of shade, so at least I won't be squinting in my thumbnail image. Look at this, I've got short sleeves on. I haven't seen my forearms or my collarbone for like 6 months just because I've been living under 5 different layers of thermals and fluffy dressing gowns. Anyway, actual conclusion stuff. This was hard. I'm not entirely sure I enjoyed it. It was very satisfying seeing the results though. I feel like I could learn to love this kind of precision work. I think this is actually as good as I could possibly get for as inexperienced as I am. Like, I'm sure that there are tweaks that I could make a year down the line when I've made like 8 more corsets, but I'm really happy with this and I hope you guys enjoyed watching this. A big thank you to my ultimate supporters. These are my top people on Patreon: Earl Monsivial Erno, Joshua, Michael, Mohican Creates, Mix Randvi, Residual Images, Robert Mischief, Tamara, Vera Lynn, and Yuri. Thank you also to these other incredible Patreon members who are on screen now. You should come and join us over on Patreon. I post previews, work in progress, and sometimes entirely exclusive mini videos. projects, like Fallon from Delicious in Dungeon, or this headpiece for my fairy vampire ball gown. Sometimes I even do giveaways as part of a competition, like recently I gave away this Harlequin hood. And of course, joining Patreon is the best way that you can support me so I can keep making ridiculous and ambitious projects like this. But even just by being here, liking, commenting, subscribing, all that good stuff that keeps the YouTube robots happy, you are also supporting me. So thank you guys so much, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!